They froze our colony to death, but forgot what human blood can survive. Chapter 1: The Awakening. The cold came first, not the biting cold of a winter morning, but something deeper, a cold that seemed to live in her bones. Mira's consciousness returned in fragments, each breath burning as her lungs remembered how to work. The darkness around her was absolute, broken only by the faint blue phosphorescence that pulsed beneath the frost-covered walls. She didn't remember falling asleep. Her fingers scraped against the floor as she pushed herself up, the sound unnaturally sharp in the silent dome. Ice crystals scattered from her clothes, tinkling like broken glass. The emergency lights should have been on. The backup generators should have kicked in. But the only illumination came from those strange, flowing patterns that traced the walls like frozen rivers. "Hello," her voice cracked, throat raw. The word echoed through the darkness, bouncing off unseen surfaces. No response. Mira fumbled at her wrist, finding the environmental monitor all colony staff wore. The screen flickered weakly to life, casting a pale glow across her face. The date display made her stomach lurch. 3 months. She'd lost 3 months. The temperature reading was impossible, -82 degrees C outside the dome. The inside reading wasn't much better. She should be dead. Everyone should be. Memory slammed back like a physical blow. The alert sirens. The Xelari ships descending through the clouds, the order to evacuate to the emergency shelters. She'd been in the hydroponics lab when it happened, running final checks on the new seedlings with Dr. Chen. "Dr. Chen," Mira called out, louder this time. "Anyone." She activated the light function on her monitor, sweeping the beam across the lab. The sight stole her breath. Everything was frozen, preserved in perfect crystal. The plants, the equipment, even the moisture in the air had been flash frozen, creating delicate lattices of ice that hung suspended like stopped time. But it was the blooms that drew her eye. Rising from various surfaces were clusters of crystalline growths, ranging from tiny sprouts to formations as tall as she was. They weren't ice, at least not entirely. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, the same blue glow that traced the walls. As her light passed over one, the surface rippled like disturbed water. Mira approached the nearest cluster, drawn by its strange beauty. The crystal was warm to the touch, defying the surrounding cold. As her fingers made contact, sound filled her head, fragments of voices, echoes of moments she hadn't witnessed. "Temperatures dropping too fast. Get to the shelters now, they're targeting civilian sectors." She jerked her hand back, heart pounding. The voices faded, but the implications hit her hard. These crystals weren't just strange formations. They were recordings, somehow preserving the final moments of the colony. Moving carefully through the frozen laboratory, Mira made her way to the emergency supply locker. The code still worked, thank whatever gods were listening, and inside she found what she needed: thermal gear, portable heaters, emergency rations, and most importantly, a proper illumination unit. As she changed into the thermal suit, questions tumbled through her mind. Why was she alive when everything else was frozen? Where were the Xelari now? And most pressingly, was she truly alone in this crystalline tomb? The main doors were sealed by ice, but the emergency release still functioned. As the panels groaned open, Mira got her first look at what remained of Colony 9. The corridor beyond was a forest of stasis blooms, their blue light creating shifting shadows that made the frozen world seem alive. The ceiling had partially collapsed in places, letting in wan sunlight that reflected off the crystalline surfaces in rainbow patterns. But it was the figures that made her blood run cold. People frozen mid-motion, perfectly preserved in transparent ice. Some were running, others helping fallen colleagues. A security officer stood with his weapon raised, facing an unseen threat. A mother clutched her child to her chest, their forms merged into a single crystal sculpture. Mira pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back nausea. This wasn't just an attack, it was a massacre. And somehow she was the only one who had survived to witness it. A distant sound echoed through the frozen corridors, the distinct crack of ice breaking. Mira's breath caught. Either the structure was continuing to deteriorate, or she wasn't alone after all. Mira killed her light immediately, pressing herself against the frosted wall. The crystalline growths around her dimmed in response to her proximity, as if sensing her need for concealment. The cracking sound came again, followed by something that might have been footsteps, too deliberate to be simple structural failure. She checked her monitor. The motion sensor was barely functioning in the cold, but it registered intermittent movement 2 sectors away, near the main research labs. If someone else had survived, that's where they'd go. The labs had separate power systems and the most advanced emergency equipment. The logical choice would be to call out, to find whoever else had survived. But 3 months of silence after a Xelari attack made logic feel dangerous. Instead, Mira forced herself to think like the colonist scientist she was. She had 3 advantages. She knew the layout, she could access any security systems still functioning, and she understood how to navigate the hazardous conditions of the frozen dome. Moving as quietly as the crunching ice would allow, Mira made her way toward the secondary monitoring station. It was closer than the labs, and if any systems were still online, she could access them there. Each step had to be carefully placed, the floor was treacherous and the frozen bodies. She couldn't bring herself to step near them, much less over them. A new sound stopped her mid-step. A voice, distant but clear, speaking words she couldn't understand. The language was unmistakable, the harsh, clicking consonants of Xelari speech. Her heart seemed to freeze colder than the air around her. The Xelari were still here, or had returned. Neither option offered much comfort. The monitoring station door was sealed with ice. Mira pulled a thermal torch from her borrowed gear and carefully melted a path to the manual release. The process felt agonizingly slow, each hiss of melting ice seeming to echo through the corridors. When the door finally cracked open, she slipped inside and sealed it behind her. The station was a mess of frozen screens and dead consoles, but the emergency terminal was designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. Mira plugged her monitor into it, providing just enough power to boot the basic systems. The screen flickered to life, bathing the small room in harsh light. What she saw made her blood run cold. The internal sensors were still partially functional, and they showed 3 heat signatures moving through the complex. 2 were clustered together near the lab's Xelari signatures, running hotter than human normal. The third was directly outside the monitoring station. Before she could move, the door's manual release began to turn. Mira scrambled back, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. The best she could find was a frozen piece of pipe that had broken free from the ceiling. She grabbed it, holding it like a club as the door slowly opened. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, frosted breath catching the light from her terminal. Human-sized, wearing what looked like modified thermal gear. Not Xelari, they were typically much taller. The figure raised empty hands slowly. "You're alive." The voice was rough from disuse but distinctly human. Male, I thought. I was the only one. Mira didn't lower her makeshift weapon. "Who are you? How did you survive?" The man stepped into the light. He was maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair frosted white at the temples. His thermal suit bore the insignia of the colony's security force, though it was modified with what looked like scavenged tech. "James Chen, security chief," he coughed, clearing his throat, "was security chief. Been tracking you since you started moving through the complex. Wanted to make sure you weren't something else." "Dr. Chen's son," Mira lowered the pipe slightly. She remembered Dr. Chen mentioning her son worked colony security, though they'd never met. He nodded, then glanced at her terminal. "You found them too, the Xelari. They've been coming back periodically, studying the—" He gestured at the walls where more of the crystalline growths pulsed with their ethereal light. "These things. The blooms, they seem especially interested in the larger clusters." "What are they?" Mira asked, finally lowering her weapon completely. "I touched one earlier, I heard voices. Memory crystals, near as I can tell. They started growing right after the attack. Something about the flash freeze process combined with—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Combined with what happened to everyone. They're like organic data storage, keeping fragments of the last moments before." A sound echoed through the corridors, closer this time. The clicking speech of the Xelari, accompanied by the whine of scanning equipment. "We need to move," James said urgently. "They're searching section by section, looking for survivors, I think, or studying the blooms. Either way, we don't want them to find us." "Wait," Mira gestured at her terminal. "The labs. There's another heat signature there, separate from the Xelari. Someone else might have survived." James's expression darkened. "That's impossible. I've been awake for weeks searching. There's no one else." "Then what?" The sounds of Xelari speech grew closer. Without another word, James grabbed the terminal, disconnecting it, and took Myra's arm. "We need to go, now. I know somewhere safe. We can figure this out there." As they slipped out of the monitoring station, Myra caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the corridor. Tall, angular figures moving with unsettling grace through the frozen wasteland they'd created. She and James pressed themselves into an alcove, waiting as the Xelari passed by. In the blue light of the stasis blooms, their silhouettes looked like something from humanity's darkest nightmares. But it was the casual way they moved past the frozen bodies, scanning and taking notes, that truly chilled Myra's soul. To them, this wasn't a tomb, it was a laboratory, and she had a terrible feeling she knew what they were studying. Chapter 2: The Survivor. James led Myra through a maze of maintenance tunnels beneath the main colony structure. Here, the frost was thinner, and fewer stasis blooms dotted the walls. Their footsteps echoed metallically, each sound making Myra wince despite James's assurance that the Xelari rarely ventured this deep. "The thermal systems down here," he explained in a low voice, "create too much interference for their scanning equipment. Been using that to my advantage." They emerged into what had once been a backup generator room, now converted into a makeshift shelter. Portable heaters created a bubble of warmth, and salvaged equipment lined the walls. A small collection of rations, water purifiers, and medical supplies suggested James had been surviving here for some time. "How did you survive the initial attack?" Myra asked as James secured the door behind them. "Why aren't we frozen like the others?" James's face tightened. "I was in the security bunker when it happened. Shielded room, separate environmental systems. By the time I got out." He trailed off, then changed course. "What about you?" "Where were you?" "Hydroponics lab with your mother." Myra watched his expression carefully. "Dr. Chen was showing me the new seedling protocols when the alert came." Pain flashed across James's features before he masked it. "Mom always did love her plants more than proper evacuation procedures." He turned away, busying himself with equipment. "The Xelari used something new, some kind of atmospheric weapon that flash-froze everything. People, buildings, even the air itself. But it did something else too, something they didn't expect." "The stasis blooms." "Yeah," he activated a salvaged display screen showing various readings and images. "They're not just recording memories, they're preserving them somehow. The bigger the cluster, the more it holds. And they seem to be growing, spreading. The Xelari keep coming back to study them, but they're scared to touch them directly. Found that out the hard way when I saw one of them make contact. The memories, they're not just audio, they're experiential." Myra remembered the voices she'd heard, the feelings that had accompanied them. "They can feel what happened. Everything, the fear, the pain, the—" James cut himself off again. "They're learning what they did to us, really learning it, and I don't think they like what they're finding." A distant rumble shook dust from the ceiling. James immediately moved to check his security feeds, jerry-rigged cameras he'd placed throughout the accessible areas of the colony. "They're in the east sector now," he reported, "getting closer to the labs. Whatever's making that third heat signature, they're looking for it." Myra joined him at the screens. "You said it was impossible for anyone else to survive, but that signature is clearly separate from the Xelari. How can you be so sure?" "Because I've checked every section of this colony that isn't completely sealed off. Multiple times, there's no one else." "Then what's causing it?" James hesitated. "I have a theory. But you're not going to like it." He pulled up an image on another screen, a massive stasis bloom cluster in the main laboratory. It pulsed with more intensity than any Myra had seen, its light almost white rather than blue. "About a month ago, this started forming. It's different from the others. The energy readings are off the charts, and the Xelari, they're fascinated by it. Terrified of it too, I think. They won't go near it, just study it from a distance." "You think it's generating the heat signature?" "I think," James took a deep breath, "I think it's more than just storing memories. I think it's storing something else. Something alive." Before Myra could respond, alarms flashed on the security feeds. The Xelari had reached the lab level, and they'd brought equipment Myra didn't recognize, heavy machinery that hummed with ominous purpose. "They're going to try to remove it," James said, voice tight with tension. "They've been building up to this. If they take that cluster, all those memories, all that evidence of what they did. We can't let them." The words came out before Mira could think them through. Whatever that thing is, whatever it's preserving, we can't let them take it. James turned to her, his expression grim but determined. There might be a way to stop them, but it's risky and we'll only get one chance. He moved to a locked container in the corner and pulled out what looked like modified environmental suits. How much do you remember about the colony's atmospheric filtration systems? Enough to know they're all frozen solid. Not all of them. A hint of his security training showed through as he began laying out equipment. There's an emergency purge system designed to clear contaminants. It still has power, and more importantly, it has pressure, if we can get to the controls and time it right. Mira caught on. We could blast them away from the cluster, she frowned, but the pressure would affect us too, and in these temperatures the force could shatter everything. That's what the suits are for, modified them myself. They'll protect us from the worst of it. He paused, but you don't have to come, this isn't your fight. Mira thought of the frozen bodies in the corridors, of Dr. Chen's last worried smile as she explained the proper care of seedlings that would never grow. She thought of the voices in the crystals, preserving humanity's final moments in this corner of space. They made it my fight when they turned my home into a tomb. She reached for one of the suits. Show me what you need me to do. James nodded, something like respect or perhaps recognition crossing his features. The control room is 2 levels up. We'll need to cross open ground to reach it, right past where the Xelari are working. Once we're there, we'll have about 3 minutes to set up the purge sequence before their scanners detect the power surge. And if we're not in position when it hits, then we join the rest of the colony in permanent freeze. He checked his weapons, a mixture of colony security gear and what looked like modified Xelari tech. Ready. Mira sealed her suit, checking the integrity indicators. Ready. As they prepared to leave their shelter, a new sound echoed through the maintenance tunnels, a crystalline resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The stasis blooms around them pulsed in response, their light intensifying. In the lab above, something was awakening. The resonance grew stronger as they navigated the maintenance tunnels, making the metal walls vibrate beneath their gloved hands. The stasis blooms they passed pulsed in sync, creating waves of blue light that followed their progress. They're agitated, James whispered, checking his scanner. The blooms, never seen them act like this. Mira studied the nearest cluster. The normally smooth crystal surface had developed intricate patterns like circuits made of light. They're connected somehow, all of them, like a network. Which means the big one in the lab is the server, Mira finished. Her scientific mind raced with implications. James, if these crystals are preserving more than just memories, if they're actually storing consciousness somehow, then that cluster in the lab might be storing everyone. His voice was tight. Everyone who died here, including my mother's. The weight of that possibility hung heavy between them as they reached the access ladder leading to the upper levels. James went first, his modified weapon at ready. The sounds of Xelari activity grew clearer, mechanical whirs, the click speech of their language, the scrape of heavy equipment being positioned. They emerged into a service corridor 1 level below the main lab. Through the frosted walls, they could see the shadows of tall figures moving with purpose, gathering around what had to be the central cluster. Equipment status? James asked, checking his suit seals one final time. Mira ran through her diagnostics. Environmental shields at full power, emergency oxygen engaged, pressure compensation active. She managed a grim smile behind her faceplate. Try not to get me killed with this plan of yours. That's the spirit, he pointed to a maintenance shaft ahead. That leads directly to the atmospheric controls. Once we're in position, I'll signal the start of the sequence. When I give the word, hit every emergency purge command you can reach. Don't stop until. A new sound cut through the air, a high, keening noise that made their suit sensors spike wildly. Through the frosted walls, they saw the shadows of the Xelari scatter back from the central cluster. The massive crystal formation was now visible, its light almost blinding. They're trying to cut into it, Mira realized with horror. They're trying to take a sample. The caning rose to a pitch that made their teeth ache even through the suits. The stasis blooms around them flared in response, their light becoming almost white. And then through their suit comms they heard something impossible, voices. Hundreds of voices overlapping, crying out in fear and anger and defiance. James staggered, catching himself against the wall. "Mom," he whispered. "Mom, is that?" "James, focus," Mira grabbed his arm. "We have to move now or we'll lose our chance." He shook himself, visibly forcing his training to override emotion. "Right. Follow me, stay low, and no matter what happens, don't stop until you reach the controls." They burst from cover, just as the Xelari activated their cutting equipment again. The keening screech returned, accompanied by a blast of light so intense it penetrated even their shielded faceplates. Mira caught glimpses of the scene as they ran, tall, angular figures in environmental suits surrounding a crystal formation that dwarfed them all, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light and shadow. An alarm sounded, they'd been spotted. James fired his weapon, sending bursts of modified energy that scattered the nearest Xelari. They returned fire, but their shots went wide, as if they were struggling to target through the crystal's pulsing light. Mira reached the maintenance shaft first, pulling herself up while James provided cover. The voices in their comms grew stronger, more distinct. She could pick out individual words now, individual people. "Protect the children, won't let them take. Remember us, please remember." A shot clipped James's suit as he climbed after her, scoring the outer layer. "Seals holding," he called before she could ask. "Keep moving." They emerged into the atmospheric control room, its banks of frozen equipment looming like abstract sculptures in the crystal light. Mira immediately began the startup sequence while James sealed and barricaded the door. "How long?" he asked, taking up a defensive position. 2 minutes to build sufficient pressure, then. The door shuddered under a heavy impact. Through the reinforced window, they could see Xelari gathering with heavier weapons. "We might not have 2 minutes," James warned. Mira worked faster, her fingers flying over the controls. The ancient machinery groaned to life, pressure gauges slowly climbing. Another impact rattled the door, stronger this time. A crack appeared in the reinforced window. The voices in their comms suddenly unified, becoming a single clear signal. We remember everything." The massive crystal in the lab flared like a newborn star. Through the observation window, Mira saw the Xelari stumble back, dropping their weapons to shield their eyes. The smaller stasis blooms throughout the complex burst into brilliant light, their crystalline surfaces flowing like quicksilver. "Now," James shouted, "hit it now." Mira slammed her hand down on the emergency purge control. For a moment nothing happened, then the world exploded. Chapter 3: The Enemy. The purge hit like a shockwave, blasting through the colony's frozen corridors with devastating force. Mira and James were thrown against the back wall of the control room, their modified suits straining against the pressure. Through the observation window, they watched Xelari soldiers tumble past, caught in the artificial tornado they'd unleashed. But something else was happening, something neither of them had anticipated. The stasis blooms weren't shattering under the pressure. Instead, they were melting, their crystalline structures dissolving into streams of luminescent mist that joined together like rivers flowing toward the central lab. The voices in their comms reached a crescendo, no longer just memories but something alive, aware, and very, very angry. "The suits won't hold much longer," James shouted over the roar of the purge. "We need to get to higher ground." They fought their way through the maelstrom, using maintenance holds set into the walls to pull themselves along. The Xelari were regrouping at the far end of the complex, their superior strength allowing them to resist the artificial wind. But they weren't advancing. Their attention was fixed on the lab, where the massive crystal cluster had become a pillar of light that reached from floor to ceiling. As Mira and James reached a secured observation post, the purge system finally gave out. In the sudden silence, they could hear Xelari emergency signals blaring, and beneath that, a sound like crystal singing. "Look," Mira breathed, pointing through the reinforced window. The luminescent mist was taking shape, forming into a swirling vortex around the central cluster. Within it, faces formed and dissolved, hundreds of them, each one a colonist who had died in the initial attack. But they weren't just images. The faces had expression, awareness, purpose. "It's not just storing memories," Mira said, her scientist's mind racing to understand. The flash freeze process combined with whatever they used in their weapon. It didn't just kill people, it preserved them. Their consciousness, their essence, everything that made them who they were. And now they're wake, James added softly, watching as his mother's face formed briefly in the swirling light. All of them. The Xelari were retreating now, falling back toward their ships. But before they could reach the airlocks, tendrils of luminescent mist shot out from the central chamber, wrapping around 3 of them and dragging them back. Not to kill them, Mira realized, but to make them understand. The captured Xelari struggled briefly, then went rigid as the mist enveloped them completely. Their environmental suits began to frost over, not from cold, but from the same crystalline formation that had created the stasis blooms. They're going to experience it, Mira said. Everything their weapon did, everyone it killed, they're going to know exactly what they did to us. The remaining Xelari fired on the mist, but their weapons passed through it harmlessly. More tendrils lashed out, capturing soldiers and researchers alike. Soon, a dozen Xelari stood frozen in crystalline shells, experiencing the memories and final moments of their victims. We should stop this, Mira said, though she made no move to intervene, before it goes too far. James watched another tendril capture a fleeing Xelari. Should we? After what they did. Before Mira could respond, their comms crackled with a new voice, one that spoke not in memories but in the present. Please, help me. The voice came from the lab level. The third heat signature they detected earlier was moving again, but weaker now. Despite everything they just witnessed, despite every survival instinct screaming against it, Mira knew they had to investigate. That's not part of the collective, she said. That's someone else, someone alive. James checked his weapons, though what good they'd do against crystalline ghosts was anyone's guess. Could be a trap. Could be a survivor. He sighed. Mom always said my hero complex would get me killed, but he was already moving toward the lab level. Stay behind me, and if anything feels wrong. Run like hell, Mira finished. Got it. They made their way down through emergency passages, avoiding the main corridors where Xelari soldiers stood frozen in their new crystal prisons. The mist parted for them, recognition rippling through it like a current. These were their people after all, the dead acknowledging the living. The lab level was transformed. What had been a frozen wasteland was now a forest of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with internal light. The massive central cluster had stabilized, its surface flowing with faces and forms like a liquid memorial. The voice called again, weaker, "Here, please." They found him in a side laboratory, slumped against a console. A Xelari, but different from the soldiers. Smaller, less armored, wearing what looked like scientific gear. His environmental suit was damaged, frost creeping across its surface. When he saw them, he raised his hands slowly, showing them empty palms. "My name is Thane," he managed through labored breathing. "I tried to stop them. The weapon wasn't supposed to," he coughed, a rattling sound. "Wasn't supposed to be used on civilians." Mira and James exchanged looks through their faceplates. Here was their enemy, dying slowly from his own weapon's effects. The crystalline mist swirled around them, waiting, watching, judging. The choice they made next would determine more than just one Xelari's fate. It would show what humanity could be, even in the face of unspeakable loss. It would show if they were better than their enemies. "We can't save him," James said, his voice hard, "after what they did." "Your mother would," Mira cut in, watching the faces flowing through the central cluster. Dr. Chen's appeared briefly, her expression not vengeful but sad. Understanding, she'd say we have to be better than them, especially now. The crystalline mist swirled more intensely, and for a moment Mira feared it would envelop Thane like the others. Instead, it formed into a clear shape, Dr. Chen standing before them as if made of light and memory. "Mom," James's voice cracked. The figure turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. When she spoke, it was with the voices of many, yet somehow still distinctly her own. Some must survive to tell the truth, some must live to make it right. The apparition reached toward Thane, who flinched but couldn't move away. Instead of crystallizing him, her touch left a mark on his suit, a flowing pattern like the stasis blooms but contained, controlled. "He tried," the many-voiced Dr. Chen said. "When they armed the weapon, he attempted to warn us. His signal was blocked, remember that." The figure dissolved back into mist, leaving them with their choice. Mira moved first, pulling medical supplies from her suit's emergency kit. "Help me with him," she told James. "We need to seal his suit before the frost reaches critical systems." James hesitated only a moment before joining her. Together, they worked to stabilize Thane's suit, using thermal patches and emergency sealant. The Xelari scientist watched them with eyes that seemed too human, too understanding. "Why?" he asked as they worked. "Why help me?" "Because that's what we do," Mira replied, checking his suit's readings. "We help, we heal. We try to be better than our worst moments." She glanced at the crystalline forest around them. "And because someone needs to tell your people what really happened here." "They know," Thane said quietly, "the ones frozen in crystal. They're experiencing everything. Every death, every loss, every moment of fear and pain, they'll never forget." "Good," James said, though some of the hardness had left his voice. "But they need to know something else too. They need to know we had the chance for revenge, and we chose differently." The mist around them pulsed with what felt like approval. Throughout the complex, the captured Xelari were beginning to emerge from their crystalline prisons, forever changed by what they'd experienced. They moved slowly, many of them weeping in their alien way, all of them marked with flowing patterns like the one on Thane's suit. "The weapon," Thane said as his reading stabilized, "it was never meant for this. It was supposed to be clean, quick, no suffering, but something in your planet's atmosphere, something in your people," he touched the marking on his suit. "It created something new. Something that preserved more than just bodies. It preserved our humanity," Mira said. "Everything that makes us who we are. Our memories, our connections, our capacity for both justice and mercy." A new sound filled the complex, the deep rumble of approaching ships. But these weren't attack vessels. Through the dome's frozen windows, they could see the distinct profile of Xelari medical ships, responding to the emergency signals from the survivors. The crystalline mist began to pulse more rapidly and the voices returned to their comms. "We have shown them. They have learned. Now you must teach them." "Teach them what?" James asked. "How to remember," the voices answered. "How to change. How to be better." The massive central cluster began to shift, its light dimming not in death but in transformation. The crystal structure slowly compressed, condensing into smaller, stable formations that lined the walls like archives of light. "The memories will remain," Thane explained, stronger now, "accessible but contained, evidence and reminder both." He looked at Mira and James. "I will make sure they're preserved. I will make sure everyone knows what happened here, both the horror and the mercy." Above them, the medical ships began their landing sequence. The surviving Xelari gathered their marked brethren, all of them changed by what they'd experienced. The war would end here, not with weapons or violence, but with understanding forced through shared experience. As the rescue teams began cutting through the dome's frozen barriers, Mira looked at the crystalline archives that would preserve her colony's final testimony. Not just their deaths, but their lives, their choices, their humanity. "We should go with them," she said finally, "to make sure they tell it right, to make sure everyone understands what really happened here." James nodded, helping Thane to his feet. "We carry more than just memories now. We carry the responsibility to make sure this never happens again." Around them, the stasis blooms pulsed one final time. A farewell, a blessing, a promise that nothing and no one was truly lost. The dead would be remembered, and the living would ensure their sacrifice meant something. It was time to show the galaxy what humanity truly meant. Chapter 4: The Truth. The Xelari medical ship Astral Mercy hung in high orbit above Colony 9, its sleek hull reflecting the distant starlight. In the observation deck's curved window, Mira watched as teams of environmental specialists began the delicate process of stabilizing the dome below. The crystalline archives glowed like blue veins through the ice, visible even from space. 3 days had passed since their rescue. 3 days of debriefings, medical examinations, and carefully worded transmissions to both Earth Command and the Xelari High Council. The war hadn't officially ended yet, but the ripples from Colony 9 were spreading fast. "They're calling it the Crystal Consensus," Thane said, joining her at the window. He moved carefully, still recovering but no longer requiring life support. The flowing mark on his suit had become permanent, spreading into intricate patterns that other Xelari viewed with a mixture of awe and fear. "Every Xelari who experienced the memories, they're changing our society from within. Military commands are being questioned, attack orders refused." "And the High Council?" Mira asked. "In chaos." Half of them are demanding we cease all offensive operations. The other half, he trailed off, mandibles clicking in what she'd learned was discomfort. The other half are afraid. They know what happens to empires that lose their grip on power. They should be afraid. James entered the observation deck carrying data tablets, but not of losing power. They should be afraid of facing the truth about what they've done. All of it, not just Colony 9. The marks on his face, faint chemical burns from his damaged suit during the purge, caught the starlight. He'd refused regenerative treatment, saying he wanted the scars. A reminder he'd told the medical team of what was lost and what was saved. The archivists are ready, he continued, handing them each a tablet. They've stabilized the primary crystal formations and begun proper documentation. But they want us to verify their initial findings. His voice caught slightly, all of us. Mira understood his hesitation. The archives didn't just contain the colony's final moments. They held everything, every memory, every relationship, every quiet moment and profound revelation, including all of Dr. Chen's memories of raising her son. We don't have to do this now, she said gently. Yes, we do, James squared his shoulders. Earth Command is sending a diplomatic fleet. The Xelari High Council is preparing a formal response to the Crystal Consensus. Whatever happens next, we need to make sure the truth is preserved exactly as it happened. Thane's mandibles clicked in agreement. My people have a saying, truth witnessed becomes truth lived, those who experience the memories directly. They're not just carrying information, they're carrying understanding, real, profound understanding of what it means to be human. And what does it mean? Mira asked, genuinely curious how a Xelari scientist would define humanity after everything that had happened. Thane touched the flowing marks on his suit. It means containing multitudes, the capacity for both violence and mercy, vengeance and forgiveness, the ability to look at an enemy and see, he paused, searching for the right words. To see possibility, the possibility of change, of redemption, of something better than endless cycles of retaliation. Poetic, James said, but without sarcasm. Now let's make sure the archives support that poetry with facts. They made their way to the ship's primary research lab, where the archival team had set up their equipment. The room was filled with smaller versions of the stasis blooms, each one carefully contained and monitored. At the center stood a direct connection to the largest remaining crystal formation in the colony below. The lead archivist, a young Xelari marked like Thane, greeted them with careful respect. We've prepared 3 interface points, she explained. The process may be emotionally challenging, but your direct experience will help ensure the accuracy of our preservation efforts. Mira took her position at one of the interface stations, watching as James and Thane did the same. The crystalline surface before her pulsed with familiar blue light waiting for contact. Together, she asked. James nodded. Thane clicked his mandibles in affirmation. They reached out as one, touching the crystal surfaces. The world dissolved into memory and light. The memories came like waves, each one distinct yet flowing into the next. Mira experienced snippets of countless lives, children playing in the colony's recreation dome, scientists celebrating breakthroughs, couples sharing quiet moments in hydroponics gardens. Joy, fear, love, loss, all preserved in crystalline perfection. Then came the attack. She felt the colony's collective terror as the Xelari ships descended, felt the confusion as the weapon deployed, the air itself turning against them. But mixed with these memories were new ones, bleeding through from the marked Xelari who had experienced them first, the weapon's designers arguing against its use on civilian targets. Thane's desperate attempt to warn the colony, his transmission blocked by his own commanders. The horror of young Xelari soldiers watching their weapons freeze an entire population in moments. By the void, the lead archivist whispered, her markings glowing brightly. We never knew, they never told us. The memories shifted, showing the aftermath. James, emerging from the security bunker to find his world transformed into crystal and ice. His weeks of survival, watching the Xelari research teams return again and again. His grief turning to purpose as he realized what the stasis blooms contained. Then Mira's awakening and the choices that followed. When they finally broke contact, all 3 interface stations were surrounded by archival team members, their markings pulsing with shared emotion. Many were weeping in the Xelari way, a soft keening sound that resonated with the crystal formations. It's all there, James said roughly, wiping his eyes. Everything, everyone. Not just the endings, Mira added. Their whole lives, everything that made them who they were. The archives don't just preserve their deaths, they preserve their humanity. Thane's mandibles quivered as he processed what they'd experienced. My people, we always saw humanity as primitive, dangerous because of your emotions, your attachments, but now, he touched his markings. Now we understand that those very things are your strength. Your connections to each other, your capacity for both justice and mercy, they make you not weaker but infinitely stronger. The lead archivist stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking with emotion. We've received word from the High Council. The crystal consensus is spreading faster than anyone anticipated. The marked ones, those who experience the memories directly, they're speaking to their communities, their families. The call for peace isn't coming from the top down anymore. It's rising from our own people. Because they understand now, Mira said, really understand. More than that, James added, they feel it, everything we felt, everything we lost. And everything we chose to preserve instead of destroy. A notification chimed through the lab's communication system. The Earth Command diplomatic fleet had arrived, along with representatives from other species who had suffered Xelari aggression. The time for private reflection was over. Now came the harder work of turning understanding into lasting change. What happens next? The lead archivist asked, looking between the three of them. Mira glanced at the crystal formations, still pulsing with the collected memories of Colony 9. We tell the truth, all of it, the horror and the hope, the loss and the learning. We make sure everyone understands what happened here, not just the weapon's effects but the choices that followed. The possibility of change, even in the darkest moments. And we honor them, James said quietly, watching his mother's face form briefly in the nearest crystal. Not just by remembering, but by building something better from what they taught us. Thane's markings pulsed with conviction. My people have a ritual for profound discoveries. We say, from this moment, two paths emerge. One leads backward to what we were, the other leads forward to what we might become, the lead archivist finished. The choice is ours. Above them, the diplomatic ships moved into position, their crews unaware that they were about to witness not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a transformation. The crystal archives of Colony 9 would change more than just human-Xelari relations. They would change how every species in the galaxy understood each other and themselves. The truth witnessed and lived would reshape the stars themselves. Chapter 5, The Choice. The diplomatic chamber aboard the Earth Command flagship Resolute hummed with tension. Representatives from a dozen species filled the tiered seating, their attention fixed on the central presentation area where the crystal archive interface had been installed. Mira stood with James and Thane before the assembled diplomats, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The Xelari High Council members sat separate from their marked brethren, their postures rigid with barely contained anxiety. The human delegates watched with a mixture of grief and determination, many having lost colonies of their own to Xelari attacks. Fleet Admiral Chen, James's aunt, stepped forward to address the gathering. Her uniform bore the marks of recent battle, and her eyes held the same haunted look as her son's. We are here, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, to witness truth. Not interpreted, not filtered, but experienced directly. The crystal archives of Colony 9 offer something unprecedented, the ability to truly understand both victim and aggressor, choice and consequence, loss and possibility. She gestured to Mira, James, and Thane. These three individuals, through their choices in the aftermath of tragedy, have shown us a path forward, not through revenge but through understanding, not through destruction but through preservation of truth. The chamber's lights dimmed as the crystal interface activated, its blue glow casting ethereal patterns across the gathered faces. Mira stepped forward. What you're about to experience, she explained, isn't just the memory of death, it's the memory of life, of choices, of who we are and what we might become. Some of you will receive the markings, as the first witnesses did, others will not, but all of you will understand. James joined her, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. My mother's last acts were not of hatred or fear, but of teaching, of sharing knowledge. Even as her world froze around her, she thought of what others might learn, The archives preserved that spirit, not just for Colony 9 but for all of us. Thane's markings pulsed as he addressed his own people. We thought we understood power, understood superiority. We were wrong. Real power lies not in weapons or conquest but in the capacity to change, to learn, to choose differently when confronted with truth. The interface hummed to life, tendrils of crystalline light reaching out to touch each delegate in turn. The chamber filled with gasps and soft sounds of wonder as the memories began to flow. They experienced everything, the colony's founding, full of hope and possibility, years of scientific discovery and cultural exchange. The first warnings of the Xelari fleet, the weapons deployment and its unexpected effects, the birth of the stasis blooms, the choices made in the aftermath. When it ended, nearly half the delegates bore the flowing marks of direct witness. Even those unmarked sat in profound silence, processing what they'd experienced. The High Council members looked shaken to their core, their previous certainty crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. Admiral Chen stepped forward again, her voice thick with emotion. The question before us now is not one of blame or retribution. It is a question of choice. What path do we take from this moment? What do we build from this understanding? One of the marked council members stood, his patterns glowing brightly. The crystal consensus cannot be denied. Our empire was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of strength and weakness. We saw emotion as primitive, attachment as vulnerability. We were wrong. He turned to face his unmarked colleagues. We must change, not because we are forced to, but because we finally understand why we must. Other delegates began to rise, marked and unmarked alike. Representatives from species long hostile to each other found themselves nodding in agreement. The chamber filled with voices offering support, suggestions, commitments to change. Mira felt James's hand slip into hers as they watched the transformation unfold. Thane stood beside them, his markings pulsing with what they now recognized as hope. "It's really happening," Mira whispered. "They're choosing to be better." "Mom would have loved this," James said softly. "All these different species learning from each other, growing together instead of fighting." "The archives will ensure it continues," Thane added. "We've already begun establishing crystal repositories on other worlds. The understanding will spread, grow, evolve." Admiral Chen approached them as the delegates began forming working groups, already planning the practical aspects of peace. "The war is over," she said simply, "not just with official declarations but in hearts and minds. The crystal consensus has changed everything." She looked at her nephew. "Your mother would be proud, James, of all of you."